Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that in 8 days, the last thread holding back a global nuclear arms race that could dwarf the Cold War will snap forever? And what if I told you that when that thread breaks on February 5th, 2026, the world will enter uncharted territory where 3 nuclear superpowers compete without limits, without verification, and without the institutional guardrails that have prevented nuclear catastrophe for over half a century? The new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty expires in 8 days. This isn't just another diplomatic deadline. This represents the end of 57 years of continuous arms control between the world's 2 largest nuclear powers. When the clock strikes midnight on February 5th, the United States and Russia will be free to deploy as many nuclear warheads as they choose wherever they choose, with no legal obligation to inform each other of their capabilities or intentions. The mathematics of what follows are sobering. Today, both nations maintain approximately 1,550 deployed strategic nuclear warheads under new START limits. Without those constraints, the Federation of American Scientists projects that deployed warheads could exceed 6,000 within a decade. That represents a 4-fold increase in weapons designed for immediate use in nuclear conflict. China, meanwhile, is expanding its own arsenal from 600 warheads today to an estimated 1,500 by 2035, creating a 3-way nuclear competition unlike anything in human history. But the numbers tell only part of the story. What dies with New START isn't just numerical limits. It's transparency, verification, and the institutional knowledge of how nuclear rivals manage their arsenals without triggering existential miscalculations. For more than 5 decades, American and Soviet, then Russian, officials have maintained continuous communication about their nuclear forces. They've conducted thousands of inspections, exchanged detailed technical data, and built the procedural frameworks that prevent worst-case scenario planning from spiraling into preemptive action. All of that ends in 8 days. The treaty's death has been years in the making, but the final act began in February 2023, when Vladimir Putin announced Russia's suspension of participation. Putin didn't withdraw from the treaty entirely, but he ended the verification regime that formed its backbone. No more on-site inspections of nuclear facilities, no more data exchanges about warhead locations and missile readiness, no more technical consultations through the Bilateral Consultative Commission that has met regularly since 2011 to resolve compliance issues and adapt to new technologies. The suspension created an information vacuum that has already begun affecting strategic calculations in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. Without direct access to Russian nuclear facilities, American intelligence agencies have had to rely on national technical means, satellites, signals intelligence, and remote monitoring to assess Russian capabilities. This shift from cooperative transparency to competitive intelligence gathering has fundamentally altered the nuclear relationship between the superpowers. Putin's stated rationale for suspension was American support for Ukraine and what he characterized as NATO's direct involvement in attacks on Russian strategic assets. But the decision reflects deeper Russian calculations about the changing global balance of power. Moscow has concluded that arms control agreements negotiated during American hegemony no longer serve Russian interests in an era of multipolar competition. By ending cooperative constraints on nuclear forces, Russia signals its intention to compete with the United States and China on terms that maximize Russian leverage rather than preserving American-designed stability mechanisms. The American response to Russian suspension has been notably restrained. Rather than withdrawing from the treaty immediately, Washington has continued to observe new START limits unilaterally while preparing for a post-treaty environment. This approach reflects competing pressures within American strategic planning. Defense hawks argue that continued adherence to obsolete limits handicaps American responses to Chinese nuclear expansion and Russian non-compliance. Arms control advocates contend that American withdrawal would eliminate any remaining incentive for Russian cooperation and accelerate global nuclear competition. The compromise position, maintaining limits while preparing for their elimination, reveals the fundamental challenge facing American strategy. The United States must simultaneously plan for a world with arms control and a world without it, knowing that the choice between these futures may no longer be entirely within American control. China's role in this transition cannot be overstated. Beijing has consistently refused to join bilateral arms control negotiations, arguing that its nuclear arsenal remains substantially smaller than those of the United States and Russia. This position was defensible when China maintained 200-300 nuclear warheads. It becomes problematic when Chinese forces approach parity with American and Russian arsenals, which current trajectories suggest could occur within the next decade. Chinese nuclear expansion has followed a different model than the Cold War buildup. Rather than pursuing maximum numbers of warheads, China has focused on diversifying its nuclear forces across land-based missiles, submarines, and aircraft, while developing advanced technologies like hypersonic delivery systems and mobile launchers that complicate adversary targeting. This approach prioritizes survivability and penetration of missile defenses over raw, destructive capacity. The strategic implications of Chinese nuclear modernization extend beyond simple force comparisons. China's approach suggests a nuclear doctrine designed for a multipolar world where nuclear weapons serve not just as instruments of deterrence, but as tools of coercive diplomacy. The ability to threaten limited nuclear use against specific targets creates options between conventional conflict and full-scale nuclear war that traditional American and Russian doctrines have sought to avoid. As New START expires, the absence of any framework governing three-way nuclear competition becomes particularly dangerous. The bilateral treaties of the Cold War were designed for a world where nuclear competition occurred primarily between two superpowers, with established communication channels and mutual understanding of each other as red lines. That world no longer exists. The current situation creates multiple pathways to crisis. American and Russian nuclear modernization programs, freed from treaty constraints, could easily be misinterpreted by Chinese planners as preparation for first strike capabilities. Chinese nuclear expansion could prompt American and Russian deployment of additional warheads to maintain credible deterrence. Any two of the three powers could pursue bilateral agreements that the third interprets as preparation for coordinated action against its interests. These dynamics are compounded by the absence of institutional mechanisms for managing three-way nuclear relationships. The diplomatic protocols, crisis communication systems, and verification procedures developed for bilateral arms control have no equivalent in a triangular nuclear competition. The risk of miscalculation increases exponentially when three parties must interpret each other's signals simultaneously while managing their own competitive pressures. The technological dimension of post-treaty competition presents additional challenges. Nuclear weapon systems under development today, hypersonic missiles, artificial intelligence-enabled command and control, autonomous delivery systems operate at speeds and with capabilities that existing crisis management procedures cannot accommodate. When warning times shrink to minutes and decision-making authority shifts to automated systems, the informal understandings that have prevented accidental war become inadequate. American military planners have begun adapting to this new environment through concepts like integrated deterrence that combine nuclear and conventional capabilities with cyber and space systems. The goal is to create multiple layers of deterrent effect that remain credible even as adversaries develop new technologies and expand their nuclear arsenals. But this approach requires levels of defense spending and technological development that may not be sustainable given competing domestic priorities and alliance obligations. Russian strategy appears focused on maximizing the coercive value of nuclear weapons through increasingly explicit threats of nuclear use in regional conflicts. The deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, threats of nuclear retaliation against countries supporting Ukraine, and development of new categories of nuclear delivery systems all suggest a doctrine that views nuclear weapons as usable instruments of military strategy rather than weapons of last resort. Chinese nuclear thinking remains more opaque, but available evidence suggests an approach that combines traditional deterrence concepts with innovations designed for information-age warfare. Chinese writings on nuclear strategy emphasize the psychological and political effects of nuclear weapons as much as their physical destructive capacity. The goal appears to be creating nuclear capabilities that influence adversary decision-making without requiring actual nuclear use. The economic implications of unconstrained nuclear competition are staggering. The United States currently spends approximately $60 billion annually on nuclear weapons programs. Estimates suggest that maintaining qualitative nuclear superiority against both Russian and Chinese forces could require doubling or tripling these expenditures over the next decade. Similar cost pressures apply to Russia and China, creating military-industrial dynamics that become self-reinforcing as each power seeks to outpace potential adversaries. These expenditures occur at a time when all three powers face significant domestic pressures. The United States confronts infrastructure deficits, social program obligations, and debt service costs that limit available resources for defense spending. Russia struggles with economic sanctions, demographic decline, and the costs of sustained military operations in Ukraine. China faces slowing economic growth, environmental challenges, and social tensions created by rapid development. The intersection of nuclear competition with these domestic pressures creates the potential for strategic miscalculation. Leaders facing internal legitimacy challenges may be tempted to demonstrate strength through aggressive nuclear posturing. Economic constraints may encourage reliance on nuclear threats as substitutes for expensive conventional military capabilities. Social pressures may make compromise in nuclear negotiations politically impossible, even when strategic logic suggests flexibility. International institutions have proven largely inadequate to address these challenges. The United Nations Security Council, where all three nuclear powers hold vetoes, cannot function as a forum for nuclear arms control when the powers themselves are the primary source of nuclear competition. Regional organizations lack the authority and expertise to address global nuclear issues. Non-proliferation regimes designed to prevent additional countries from acquiring nuclear weapons have little relevance to competition among existing nuclear powers. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which obligates nuclear weapon states to pursue disarmament, faces a crisis of credibility as the major powers expand rather than reduce their arsenals. Non-nuclear weapon states increasingly view arms control obligations as one-sided, applying only to countries seeking to acquire nuclear weapons, while existing nuclear powers modernize and expand their arsenals without meaningful constraints. This dynamic creates incentives for nuclear proliferation that compound the challenges of three-way competition. Countries that have renounced nuclear weapons under international agreements may reconsider those commitments if the major powers abandon arms control entirely. Regional powers facing nuclear-armed adversaries may conclude that their own nuclear weapons programs offer more security than international guarantees that appear increasingly unreliable. The most immediate risk in the post-New START environment may not be deliberate nuclear war, but rather accidental conflict escalation. As nuclear forces expand and modernize without transparency measures, each power must make assumptions about adversary capabilities and intentions based on incomplete information. These assumptions inevitably tend toward worst-case scenarios that can become self-fulfilling prophecies. Historical analysis suggests that periods of rapid nuclear buildup create multiple opportunities for crisis. Technical failures in early warning systems, miscommunication during tense political periods, and unauthorized actions by military personnel have all brought nuclear powers to the brink of conflict during previous arms race periods. These risks multiply when three powers compete simultaneously and when new technologies reduce warning times and increase the complexity of nuclear operations. The pathway beyond February 5th remains unclear, but several scenarios appear possible. Putin has offered to extend New START limits unilaterally for 1 year, though without the verification measures that gave the treaty meaning. American officials have shown little enthusiasm for this proposal, particularly given Russian non-compliance with treaty provisions since 2023. The more likely scenario is complete treaty expiration followed by a period of unconstrained nuclear competition. Alternative frameworks for nuclear cooperation remain possible, but would require unprecedented levels of political commitment from all three powers. Trilateral arms control negotiations involving the United States, Russia, and China would need to address verification challenges, technological disparities, and fundamental differences in nuclear doctrine. The complexity of such negotiations, combined with the deteriorated state of great power relations, makes meaningful agreements unlikely in the near term. Interim measures like voluntary transparency initiatives, crisis communication protocols, and limited technical cooperation could help manage some risks of three-way nuclear competition. But these measures depend on political will that may not survive the competitive pressures of an unconstrained nuclear environment. Once nuclear modernization programs begin operating without treaty constraints, the institutional momentum toward expansion becomes difficult to reverse. The ultimate irony of New START's expiration is that it occurs at a moment when nuclear risks are already elevated by multiple regional conflicts, technological disruptions, and great power competition. Rather than addressing these challenges through strengthened cooperation, the major powers are choosing to eliminate the remaining constraints on their nuclear competition. The result may be a period of nuclear instability that makes the Cold War appear restrained by comparison. 8 days from now, the world will discover whether the institutions and norms developed during the bipolar nuclear era can survive the transition to multipolar nuclear competition. The answer to that question will determine not just the future of arms control, but the fundamental structure of international security for decades to come. The countdown has begun, and there is no mechanism to stop it.